Welcome back to another For Honor Realism analysis. In today's video, we're going to be talking about just the moveset, as we've already gone over armor in the last episode, and then we went over weapons, emotes, finishers, etc. in the episode before that. Now, before we continue with this episode, let me just say thank you to all of you who have been watching these, as I can see that a lot of you really enjoy these videos, and I enjoy making something that all of you can appreciate. These videos have received a wave of support recently, so much so that somehow Blackbriar Part 2 video has more views than the Part 1 video. Like, almost tripled it somehow. So either YouTube decided to promote that video in particular for reasons we do not fully understand, or everyone was just way more interested in seeing the armor. Either way, I'm glad that you guys have been enjoying these videos. Speaking of these videos, in the top right corner there will be a poll for what hero you would like to see next. So remember to vote for who you want the next video to be on. I'll remind you guys again at the end of this video. One final thing I'd like to discuss to all the new people who comment that I'm trying to make the game too realistic when it's not meant to be, or I'm trying to debunk the game's realism. There's nothing to debunk or to change. These videos aren't meant to be a suggestion of what they should do, but more or less an acknowledgement of what they have done. These videos are called an analysis for a reason, and it's just to merely observe the design choices that have been done in the game, and then draw parallels to what we know about real life. People then try to argue that this is a complete fantasy setting and there's no reason to be so critical. I would then say to those people that just because it's a fantasy game doesn't mean that you can't draw inspiration from history or from real life. In fact, in many of my videos, I've shown examples of them imitating historical depictions. One of the reasons I do these videos is because it would be a disservice to the artists and designers who make these subtle nods to history to not acknowledge their work, and it would be a disservice to my viewers who might be curious on what is feasible and what isn't to not critique what is wrong. Now, I may voice my opinion from time to time on what I would like to see in the game, but anyone can do that. One man's opinion is not going to change what Ubisoft wants for their vision of this game. I have played the game for over 1,000 hours and I'm about over 120 something in reps, which I know isn't that big compared to other players, but still. I would like to think by this time I understand that this isn't a medieval combat simulator and it's actually an arcadey fighting game with nonsensical effects and mechanics that defy reality. So it's not a hot take to say that For Honor is an unrealistic game. In fact, due to that reason, I'm compelled to really show the things that are very realistic and the things that I think are comically unrealistic. Because remember, videos like these are for everyone's entertainment first and foremost. So don't try to read too much into it, okay? I just wanted to get that out there because there's some people who were actually genuinely curious, along with some other people that I know were most likely trolling. So I'm probably not going to stop getting those comments, but it was worth a shot at least. Public service announcements aside, let's get back to the content of this video, and like always, we will start with the stances. Blackbriar has 4 stances to match his 4 guard directions. This includes top guard, left guard, right guard, and full guard. Let's start with the top guard. For the top guard, a common theme you'll see with almost all of BP's stances is that he really never puts his shield in a defensive location. In fact, for a majority of them, he kind of just stands in a lackadaisical stance where he doesn't seem really ready to fight and he doesn't seem very enthused either. Back to shield positioning, it's put too much far to the side. When it's in a stance like this, it should be in front of him. From where his shield is placed right now, he would have to move it on reaction to defend his center of mass. Compare that to the top guard of a hero like Conqueror, then you can see that BP isn't really guarding his top at all. Really, this stance only needs a few adjustments to make it a bit more realistic. For starters, I would place the shield over his body more so he's using it as a constant form of protection. Then I would widen the gap between his feet to make his stance look a bit more grounded so he doesn't look like he could get drop kicked immediately. Last thing I want to talk about is the sword placement. I think it's great because this sword placement leads directly into an attack, but we'll get to that when we move on to attacks. For now, just know that this wouldn't be one of the things that I would change. Next, let's move on to left guard. In this one, we can see the shield doesn't move much in position, but that's not a big deal this time as it is the left guard and technically the shield is protecting the left side. I kind of like the sword placement on this one as it's positioned to where it can quickly throw out a cut from the left side if needed, but can also reposition the sword if needed as well. The footwork for this one is as lackluster as the previous one to say the least, and on a final note, the one thing I might add is for the shield to stick out a bit more from the user as that will provide better protection. We talked about this in the Conqueror analysis, so I suggest watching that if you'd like a bit more knowledge on shield usage, especially since I will most likely be drawing a lot of parallels between the two knight shield users throughout this video. As for the shield being presented out more, I'm sure that this shield is a bit heavier than Konk's much smaller heater shield, so it is possible that he doesn't present the shield out to reduce fatigue, although he ends up sticking it out anyways to block an attack, which I would have to assume is much more exhausting after doing it multiple times, so I don't really know with this one. Moving on to the right guard, this is probably the worst out of all of them as he's blatantly just standing there. The weapon really isn't at the ready, the shield isn't covering his body, he's just standing there. Menacingly! Again, this could be much better like Konk's side guards because this is just blatantly leaving the side that he's going to be attacked from open. It's not really guarding anything at all, and I'll talk more about this when we get to blocks. Moving on to the full guard, this is one of the most defensive out of all the guards, and rightfully so. He actually spreads his weight out so that way he has more stability in his footwork. Also, bringing himself lower to the ground makes his body profile smaller, meaning it's a harder target to hit, and he can also conceal himself behind the shield more. This is probably the simplest and yet most effective guards you could do, and what most people would instinctively try to defend themselves with a shield would do. Let's talk about blocks now. I always talk about how the heavy attacks force the enemy to stumble, and I brought up the issue with this in past videos, so for the sake of not being redundant, I recommend you watch Conqueror Part 3 analysis if you want my thoughts on it. Otherwise, in short, no one should allow themselves to become that imbalanced that quickly. As for light blocks though, this is interesting because we can see that the Black Prior is forced to meet the attack instead of being proactively in a position to defend himself. We talked about creating distance with your shield in Conqueror Part 3, but the gist of it is having your shield so close to your body is that it won't be able to cover your whole body as effectively as having it further out. Having it further will also help create more distance from your opponent, and this also decreases the likelihood of the opponent being able to close the gap and land an attack on you. Also, with Black Prior's reactionary style of defense, we can see that they have to be fast, if not faster than the attack coming in to effectively block it. Realistically, to expect to do this all the time with a shield that could be quadruple the weight of an average arming sword and beat them to it before they land a hit on you is a bit ludicrous. One last thing we can see mostly with the right side block is the fact that BP tends to overextend himself when it comes to blocking an attack. We can see him reach across himself, which isn't just blocking his view, but also exposing the entirety of his body now. If this was a cleverly thrown feint, he could very much be falling into the trap to attack his now exposed side of the body. One somewhat good thing that I will talk about with the light blocks would probably be the top block. We can see that the shield is raised to stop an attack from the top, which sends the attacker reeling, and the defender has their sword in a prime position to thrust while the opponent is essentially disarmed momentarily. The key to this though is that it would all need to be done in a single fluid movement. While the attacker's weapon is only going to be raised momentarily, the window of opportunity is very small to employ a counterattack. Obviously, the in-game BP doesn't take advantage of this, but that's also partly because his hero has another form of counterattack that we'll get to a bit later. Let's move on to parries. For the side parries, they are, for the most part, the same. They appear to catch the opponent's weapon somehow, and then they cast it aside. It's pretty standard to see something like this for most parries in the game across the roster, but it doesn't make that much sense to do it with something like this shield. The much more interesting parry is the top parry. At first it looks like it's going to be another type of parry like the side parries, but then you can see the defenders slip their sword beneath the shield and use that to cast away the attacker's weapon. If I were in that position and could slip my sword to be in front of the shield like that, I would try to attack the opponent's exposed parts like their attacking arm, rather than cast them aside and give them a chance to recover. That being said, at least in this parry, they cast aside the opponent's weapon with their weapon, which makes more sense than using a shield to do that. Moving on to attacks, let's start with BP's defensive attacks first. To begin, we have the crushing counters. These aren't as interesting to analyze as I was anticipating them to be. They appear to just be normal light attack animation with unblockable properties. So I'll talk about the actual light attacks in a bit, but as for the rest of this attack, it's nice that they have it, but it'd be much cooler if it had its own counter attack animation like Warden's top crushing counter. Next, we have BP's dodge forward heavy called Tenebrous Thrust. This also has a form of superior block, and I personally love using this because no one ever seems to expect it coming, and if you see people top lighting a lot, you could get a free top heavy off of a cheeky read. We're not here to talk about that though, we're here to talk about how realistic it is. Honestly, it's actually pretty good. It works based off of the top guard's stance. It also places the shield in front of him so that it protects and attacks at the same time, which is an important fundamental to weapon-based combat. It's also a thrusting attack, which is good to see because this is meant to be a cut and thrust sword. The only real problem I have is the footwork as he dashes forward, as it looks like he's crossing his feet and he looks like he's stumbling a bit. Beggars can't be choosers though, and I think that besides that, this is an overall solid move, so I can't really complain. Now, talking about the last form of counterattack, we have the community-loved Bulwark counter. Do you need me to tell you how ridiculous this is? Don't get me wrong, I think it's a fun mechanic and it's hilarious, but I mean, come on. The attacker literally gets sucked in like a black hole and then gets weightlessly flipped onto the other side. Maybe it could have made sense if it were more like a throw to the ground and it looked more like a type of takedown grapple, but the attacker literally takes flight, and it becomes even more nonsensical when you add multiple opponents. This is a great example of a good game mechanic that adds to the gameplay overall, but isn't very realistic at all. And that's okay. While we're talking about Bulwark, we might as well talk about the Bulwark Slash. This is a pretty overly telegraphed slash, but understand that because this is a fighting game, it's mostly intentional, so let's look past that. The footwork is ridiculous on this. The initial part of the attack where he brings the sword back for a slash looks like he's about to do an ice skating performance. Besides that, you don't really need to pull a sword back that far, but I get why they did it in the game. One of the biggest problems with this cut that he throws is the fact that it's going in a completely horizontal direction. This is probably the easiest cut that you can counter just due to the fact that it is very blatant in the direction that it goes, and it's not leading into another guard direction. It's much better to have your cuts go into some form of angle, which actually leads us into our next part. Now we're going to talk about light attacks. This is probably the best form of cuts thrown in his entire kit, and I will show you why. For starters, no matter what cut you throw from any direction, you can then combo it into another light attack from either the same direction or a different direction, and it will move fluidly into the next cut without spinning. That's already a great start, but another good thing is that if you see how the side cuts are thrown, you can see that they're angled, even if ever so slightly. With that angling, you can see that it makes it much easier to combo from a right side rising cut to a left side descending cut. That is for the most part the proper way to cut with a sword and why the angle of the cut is important. This brings us to basic principles like Myers Square and a lot of sword techniques that aren't really important right now, but if you want a basic video from me about basic sword techniques, then let me know. Otherwise, there are a lot of great sources that are already out there. Now, BP's footwork isn't terrible, but I wouldn't say that it's the best, and he also tends to overswing on these cuts. But it still looks pretty good, and I would only recommend that he keeps his shield up more while throwing the cuts to prepare to defend himself if the need arises. Now, as for cuts from the top, it's not unreasonable to throw a cut straight down, but his follow-up cut from the top is a bit overdramatic to say the least. He exposes his body quite a lot from that position, so I wouldn't say that it's that practical of a cut. Now, before we move into any heavy attacks, I just want to quickly talk about one attack before that, the sprinting heavy attack. It might be my pent-up frustration talking about this attack, but I don't care. This attack is shit. This, first of all, confirms that Blackprior is just a professional figure skater. What is this shit? Why does his sprint attack consist of him sliding across the floor, then lazily throwing his sword in a direction, hoping that he'll hit something? And what is that little extra spin he does at the end? By the time the weapon makes contact with the opponent, he's already facing them. So what's the point of the spin? I think he just wants to show the enemies the cute little front spin he's been working on, but for a character who has a massive shield and a bunch of armor, why is his running attack a spinning slash? Wouldn't it make more sense just to make his running attack his dodge forward heavy? Honestly, I probably wouldn't mind the little spin and slash if it actually hits things. You couldn't hit the broadside of a barn with this attack, let alone minions who are just standing there asking to be hit. Even if you were to hit something like a player, it only deals 25 damage, and it's like a 1000 MS move. I can't even. I could rant about how terrible this move is, but you get the point. Ubisoft just needs to completely overhaul his sprinting attack, not just the animation, but also the game mechanics of it. But now that we got that out of the way, we can move on to heavy attacks. Like most heavy attacks in the game, they're very slow, very telegraphed, and overswing a lot. I do like that they kept the angles of the cuts the same. They do have spinning when the cuts are thrown from the same side, but they move fluidly if the cuts go from left to right, right to left, top to right, or right to top. Overall, I can't really say that any of these cuts are practical, especially compared to the light attack cuts, but that's usually how it goes for all heroes. Since we just talked about heavy attacks, I think the only one that makes sense when moving on to bashes is to start with a heavy soft feint into bash known as Hawk's Charge. So I genuinely like this bash, not because it doesn't look as wonky as Conqueror's heavy soft feint. I don't think anything can look as borked as that, but it's because what happens with the bash itself. If we stop time and look at what's actually happening during the bash, we can see that Black Prior actually takes cover behind his shield while moving up. He's even protecting his head behind the shield, which is good considering that 75% of Black Priors probably don't have a helmet. I also like that it has charge in the move's name, because that's a very apt description. This is truly a forward assault move meant to advance you forward into your enemy. Now, how practical is something like this? Well, for starters, let me just say that this move barely works in game for me, as it's pretty well telegraphed. I usually don't use it at all for that reason, but as for real life, I'd say it depends. Maybe not the best decision to tuck your head behind your shield if you're going to get into close quarters distance with your enemy, but if you're charging to another location under arrow fire, you'd probably be defending yourself to something like this. So as a bash, I can't say it's very realistic, but as a form of defense, then it's not that bad. That makes me think that something like this might be an interesting concept to introduce, something along the lines of how Orochi does his Riptide Strike, but instead of concealing your guard direction, it puts you in a full guard direction as you rush your opponent. I don't know what you could do with a mechanic like this, but it's an interesting thought nonetheless. As for the next bash, I'm sure we're going to be all very familiar with this one. So for this one, it's quite interesting because it looks like the bash might be coming from the edge of the shield, but even if I stop the game right as it makes contact with the opponent, it could be making contact with the flat of the shield or with the edge of the shield and just angled to the side of the opponent's body. It could really be either, so I'm just going to give it the benefit of the doubt and say that it's with the edge of the shield, which is the most effective way to daze someone with a shield. It looks like it's a solid uppercut too, so overall it's not that bad. Unfortunately, I have not been bashed in the head, nor have I gotten to bash someone in the head with a full-size kite shield, or a heater shield for that matter, so I can't tell you exactly how effective it would be to hit someone in the head. I would assume that it would have at least some effect if used situationally, and not like how it is used in the game. Speaking about bashing with the edge, let's finish the bashes on somewhat of a high note. High note as in, if you like comically odd-looking animations. His final bash is his zone attack, called Horizon Spin. This move inherently isn't weird, it's just how over the top they made the animation for it. So basically what it is just striking with the edge of the shield. Nothing new, pretty solid, seems practical. It gets bad when you see how far he cocks his arm back. This dude is planning on sending you into the next dimension with this hit. He looks like he's about to Beyblade let it rip you in two pieces. His shield is so far back, if he just went a little bit further, he probably could have done a spinning backhand strike with the shield. Also, he's so low to the ground that if you were to just push him a little bit backwards, he would definitely fall down flat. But I mean, after he's done charging up his Rasengan and he actually decides to hit the opponent, it's not that bad. He overswings, but that's not really news. If you wanted to strike someone with a shield like that in real life, you don't need to bring it that far back. The most power you'll generate comes from the rotation of your torso and your hips. So really, you don't need to twist that far back. Besides the fact that you barely would generate that much more power, in Blackprior's anime stance here, you can see that he isn't properly protecting himself with his shield. Not like he was beforehand, but if he were, he just forfeited it so he could become the next Hokage of the hidden volcano village. Finally, let's finish up by talking about guard break throws. So usually there are 4 unique animations for how a hero throws an opponent who'd just been guard breaked, and 1 animation for each direction. I genuinely think that there are 3 this time, and that they all involve hitting someone with the edge of the shield, which are all very realistic for the most part, so I can't complain. Starting off the forward throw, it's just a jab to the head, which knocks the opponent back. It's pretty good. Next is the left side throw, another hit with the far bottom edge of the shield, also really solid. Now we get to the right side throw. As you can see, just a really simple left hook with the edge of the shield, which moves the opponent to the right. That's not bad. In fact, that's quite okay. Now moving on to the back throw, we can see that it's a left hook with the edge of the shield. I genuinely can't tell the difference between the right side throw and the back throw for BP. They might just have the same animations unless there's some minor details I'm missing, but either way, they're relatively the same, and they're pretty realistic for the most part, so I mean, kudos to them. That's it for this video. Remember to vote for who you want to see in the next analysis. A poll will be in the cards in the top right corner of this video. I'll give it about a week before I'll call it closed. Hopefully I mentioned everything in BP's kit and I'm not forgetting anything too important. But as always, if you like this video and you want to see more videos like this, then subscribing would be your best bet. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or stories about how Black Prior inspired you to fulfill your figure skating dreams, then feel free to share them down below. I'm curious and excited to see what you guys choose for me to do next and to see you all then. I hope you guys have a great day. Peace.